Hello and welcome to TheFIX, a podcast about post-processing and the cool and creative things we get to do with our images after the shoot. I'm your host, Seán Duggan, and on this week's show, we're going to take a trip into Photoshop land to explore some of the ways that you can create color toning or hand coloring effects for your black and white images. Stay with us. Hey everybody, thanks for stopping by and joining me here in my corner of thisweekinphoto.com. As I mentioned in the intro, we've got two topics on the dance card for this week's show: color toning and creating a hand coloring or hand tinting effect. So in the first one, we're going to take a look at just creating an overall toning effect for your images in Photoshop, kind of like a sepia tone, something like that. But then we're going to take it a couple of steps further. We're going to make some changes to our adjustment layers to then create an irregular toning effect to where part of the image is toned and part of it is not. And taking it even a step beyond that, we're going to do a two-tone or a split tone color effect where part of the image has maybe a more subtle lower saturation toning applied to it, and other parts of the image have a brighter, higher saturation toning applied to it. It kind of mixes it up a little bit, creates an image with a lot of really interesting color and tonal depth. Then we're going to take a look at some ways that you can create a hand coloring or hand tinting effect. Now, of course, that terminology refers back to the time when there were no color photographs. There were just black and white photographs, and if a photographer wanted to portray a scene in color, they had to actually add paint to the surface of the photograph to create that color look. And I'm sure that you've seen examples of such images in the past. Some of them can be quite charming, especially when they're applied to vintage historical images. So we got a lot to cover. Let's not dawdle. Let's dive right in. I'm going to start out with some simple toning techniques so that you can add a color tone or a color tint to a grayscale black and white photograph. And I'm going to be working with this photograph here that I got from the Flickr stream of the U.S. Library of Congress. It shows two women working in a Detroit machine shop or factory sometime between 1915 and 1920. Although comments on the page indicate it's probably or likely to be around 1917. And if you haven't explored the Flickr page of the Library of Congress, I heartily encourage you to do so, especially if you are somebody who loves to look at old vintage historical images. And they have quite a lot from all eras of photography. And when you click on it, so for instance, here's this one of the women in the machine shop, it'll take you to a page with additional information about the photograph, and you can see that they tag it very well. And they also have a lot of followers who are really great at providing additional information. So that's where the idea that maybe this was from 1917 came from some of the comments of their loyal followers, who also provide additional information. For instance, here's more information on how overalls for women sort of came into fashion in 1917 as the U.S. entered World War I. But what I really like about the Flickr page of the Library of Congress is the fact that they provide a permanent, persistent URL to a high-resolution image at the Library of Congress website. So if you go there, you have access to higher res files. So for instance, here I could download a nearly 24 megabyte TIFF file of this image. So a lot of these are free to use. There's no known copyright restrictions or publication restrictions, I should say, on them. So if you're somebody who likes historical photographs and checking them out in detail and likes to be able to have access to those high-res files, I definitely encourage you to check it out. I some days spend hours just wading through the photographs, finding these cool old images. I will put a link to that in the show notes. All right, let's get back to Photoshop here and talk about this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to get this ready to be turned into a color image. And by that I mean it's mainly going to still have a black and white look to it, but I am going to add kind of a sepia tone, and then I'm going to show you how to add a partial sepia tone to selectively tone only certain areas of the image. But the first thing I need to do is I need to convert this into RGB mode. Now, since I downloaded this from the Library of Congress website, this is that 24 megabyte TIFF file that I downloaded. It is in grayscale mode, and I can see that here if I come up to the top of the Photoshop interface where I see the tabs, where we can see the name tab here. You can see it says gray, so that is the color mode. So I'm just going to come up here to the image menu and choose mode RGB color. And we won't see any difference in the image in terms of how it looks visually, but now it is a color image. So actually let me undo that. And if we go to the channels panel here, and let me just tear this out so we can see it a little bit better here. If we go to the channels panel, we can see that we just have a single channel for gray. But when I go up and I choose image mode RGB color, suddenly we have the 3 color channels and their RGB composite. So now it is a color image, even though it still appears to be in grayscale. It has the capability to accept color information, and that is what we need. So I'm going to come back to my layers panel, and the first thing I want to do is I want to improve the overall tone and contrast of this image. It looks a little bit light and maybe washed out, so I want to darken it down a little bit more. So I'm going to come down to the Add Adjustment Layer button, and I'm going to choose Curves. And in the Curves Adjustment panel here, I'm going to just drag down on the lower part of the curve to make those darker tones a little bit richer. And that's looking pretty good. I don't think I really need to come up on the highlights too much. I don't want their blouses and shirts here to get too washed out. Maybe down a little bit more on the shadows. And if I check out the before and after, yeah, that's looking pretty good. I think that is going to work. I'll just leave that like so. And next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a hue and saturation layer. So I'll click up here to make sure my curves layer is the active layer, because anytime you add a new layer, it always shows up on top of the previously active layer, and I do want to have my new layer on top of that. I'll come to the Add Adjustment Layer button at the bottom of the Layers panel, and I'll choose Hue Saturation. And over in the Properties panel for the Hue Saturation layer here, I'm going to click the Colorize button, which will automatically fill it with red. And the reason it's filling it with red is it's just the 0 position on the hue slider. So that's the reason that's coming in that way. So I'm just going to move that to where I get more of a brown tone. So somewhere here along about hue value of 44, maybe 38, something like that. Looks pretty good. And I can saturate that as I see fit. So right off the bat, that is one quick way that you can add a toning effect, like a sepia tone, to an image. And of course, you feel free to choose whatever tone is going to work for your project aesthetically. So there's a blue tone here if I thought that would look good. You set that back to about 35, 36. And I'm going to lower the saturation down a little bit there to bring that down. So that's looking good. If I just wanted a sepia effect, boom, I'm in the money here. Working good. But let me show you how to selectively tone this. I'm going to make the layer mask active for my hue saturation layer. And by the way, whenever you add an adjustment layer in Photoshop, it automatically comes along with a layer mask. Sort of, buy one, get one free. You automatically get a free layer mask when you add an adjustment layer in Photoshop. I'm going to get my paintbrush tool, and I'm going to make sure that black is my foreground color. Up in the options bar, I'm going to lower my opacity down to about 50% roughly. By the way, you can change the opacity just by tapping a number on the keyboard. So for instance, if I tapped an 8, it would go to 80%, 0 gets me back to 100, 3, 30%, etc. I'm going to go back to 50%. And what I want to do is I want to remove that sepia tone from some of the, obviously metallic areas in the photograph. So I'm going to paint on this wheel here, this big flywheel that's spinning. I'm glad these ladies have their hair up because, man, that looks pretty dangerous there. The factory conditions back in 1917 were probably nothing to write home about in terms of safety. I'm sure a lot of people endured a lot of serious injuries in places like this. All right, so that looks good. I'm going to come over here to this flywheel in the back, the one that's not moving, and I'm going to just paint over that. And if you look at my layer mask here, you can see how I'm adding that dark gray color to the mask. If I Option or Alt click on the thumbnail of the mask, we can see it. Now, if you're new to layer masks, all this means is that in a layer mask, white will show you what that layer does, and black will hide it or not show it. Areas of gray will show it partially. The darker the tone of gray, the less the effect of that layer will show, and the lighter the tone of gray, the more it will show. So you can see here I've got an area of pretty dark gray close to black, where I painted back and forth on that. So none of the sepia tone really is showing up in there, whereas in the rest of this, I have a partial sepia tone showing up. I'm going to Option or Alt click on that thumbnail of the mask to go back to the regular view of the image here, and I'm just going to continue painting on here a little bit. So I'm just going to do this really quick and dirty. My aim here is to make the obvious machine components here in this shop or this factory grayscale, or the normal black and white tone. And I want to have the other areas be more of that sepia tone. So, for instance, I'm going to have the clothing on the women be sepia tone. I'm going to have their hair be sepia tone. But the all the metal things, that's a technical term there, metal things. Anybody who's worked in a factory knows about metal things. I'm going to have that be kind of the normal black and white look. So that looks good. Got a lot of wood boxes down here. I'm just going to leave those the way they are, because, you know, the wood, that sort of suggests to me that it's going to be a regular kind of warm tone. And I'm going to lower my opacity to maybe 30% and just kind of paint a little bit up here in the ceiling, where obviously there's some metal flywheels up there. You can see that there's all these, you know, belts spinning around here. Who knows what they were working on here in this factory? I bet it was really noisy. So this is just, you know, a real kind of loose and casual effect here in terms of coloring this. And let's come in a little bit closer here and paint some more of this. Again, I'm painting on the mask with black. It may appear as if I'm painting with blue, but I'm not. I am painting with black to reveal the normal grayscale tones of the photograph coming through. And the other thing you can do too is that you could paint over parts of these areas at varying opacities to create the effect where some aspects of the machine here are a little bit bluer than others, and other ones have maybe some traces of kind of a brown tone on them. I'm not going to worry about the darker areas too much because they don't really show the color that much. Here we go. This one I can actually bring in some of that natural black and white tone. We'll just sort of make that gray as well. So I'm guessing you probably get the idea. Depending on how accurate you want your toning or colorizing to be, that will determine how long this operation is going to take you, as well as also how intricate the image is. If there's a lot of things where you really need to go over them in a more detailed way, then it's going to take you a lot longer. So I'm coming up in here in the kind of the background areas that we can see behind this spinning flywheel here, the interior of the flywheel, and I'm just kind of colorizing those in to give that suggestion that that is, you know, we're seeing through to the background there. And maybe a little bit down there. All right, let's zoom back out. And there we have it. So that actually is looking pretty interesting, I think. And this is an effect that I've used a lot in some of my own fine art photographs, particularly ones that I've shot with my wooden pinhole camera or my series of vintage plastic toy cameras like the Holga camera or the Diana camera. I've used this quite a lot in the past. It was a look that I really liked. It's actually still a look that I really like, and I think it really lends itself to certain photographs, such as this image right here. All right, one other thing I'm going to do here, and this is something that I frequently do after I've applied an initial toning effect, is I'm going to come back to my adjustment layer, and I'm just going to make some fine-tuning adjustments to that curve. I'm going to darken this down a little bit more, and I think that's going to make this just seem a little bit richer in the shadows in there, and just overall a lot nicer. There we go. That's looking pretty good. I really like the way that that is looking. Now, another thing that you could do is you could add another hue saturation layer. So let me click up on the top there, and I'm going to add another hue saturation layer. And this time what I'm going to do is, again, I'll click colorize. I'm going to enter in 35 for the hue value, which I think is what I had before. But this time I'm going to saturate it a lot more, maybe bring it up to about 38. I'm going to invert this mask. Now, if you click on the thumbnail of the mask in the properties panel, you'll see that there is a button for inverting the mask. And if I click that, it'll just invert that. Or the great keyboard shortcut for that would just be to choose Command-I on a Mac or Control-I on Windows, and that will invert the tonality of the mask, or whatever item is active. For instance, if you have an actual photograph active, it will invert the photograph and make it look like a negative. All right, so I have this kind of stronger sepia. I'm going to get my brush tool and make my brush bigger here. By the way, the way that I'm showing this kind of heads-up view of the brush size shown in red here is I'm holding down the Control and Option key on a Mac and dragging from side to side to change the size of the brush. That would be Alt right-click and dragging from side to side on Windows. And if you use those same keyboard modifiers and drag up and down, you can change the hardness of the brush. For my purposes, I do want a fairly soft brush, so I'll leave that fairly soft there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in, and in the background in here where there's this light from the windows, I'm going to paint to bring in a little bit more of that kind of brighter, more yellowy look there. Almost like, you know, we're looking back and maybe there's some bright sunlight shining through here in the back of the factory. If you go too far, as I feel that I have done here on the left side of the image, I'll just tap X on the keyboard to exchange my colors, and now I'll paint with black, and I'll remove some of that. Maybe I'll lower the opacity a bit so I'm not removing it at full strength. Tap X again to continue painting with more of that kind of bright color back there. And I might even put some, like it's showing through here, kind of behind the flywheel here in the background areas. Maybe I'll make the belts of the wheel a little bit more saturated. So what this effect is giving me is it's creating the look of the sepia tone, but I've got sort of different intensities of sepia tone on different parts of the image. And so I really like to kind of mix it up that way. It makes it look not quite so uniform in terms of how that sepia tone is applied. And a lot of this is just kind of a back and forth, going over and over again, multiple times over different parts of the image. All right, so that is one potential way that you could modify an image by adding a custom tone. Let me put these layers here into a layer group. So I selected those 3 layers by clicking on the top one and then shift clicking on the bottom one. I'm not including the background. And I'm going to drag this down to the group icon here, and I'll just call this Sepia Effect 1. And I'm going to turn that layer off. So the other way that we could potentially do this is by adding a color fill layer and using a luminosity mask within that color fill layer. So in terms of creating a luminosity mask, I'm going to just come to the channels panel, and I'm going to hold down the Command key on Mac or the Control key on Windows, and I'm going to just click on the name or the thumbnail of the RGB channel to load that up as a selection. Of course, the way that selections work, the lighter areas are more selected than the darker areas. I want to inverse this selection, however, so I'm going to go up to the Select menu and choose Inverse, Shift Command I or Shift Control I on Windows to inverse that. And next what I'm going to do is come to my Layers panel, and I'm going to click on the Add Adjustment Layer button, and I'm going to choose Solid Color. Actually, before I do that, let me do that a different way. because I want to have access to a little dialog before I add the layer that has an option that is critically important for this. So I'm going to hold down the Option key. Speaking of options, I'm going to hold down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on Windows, and now I'm going to click the Add Adjustment Layer button at the bottom of the Layers panel, and I'll choose Solid Color. And this is the little dialog that I wanted to have show up, the New Layer dialog. And the reason that I wanted that is because here I can change the blending mode of this layer before I add it. And I'm going to choose Multiply for the blending mode. And I'll click OK. And in the Color Picker dialog, I'm going to move the slider here in the hue bar, the spectrum bar, to choose, kind of a brownish color. And now you can see I'm adding that in there. Now, if we look close here in the Layers panel, you'll see that my selection has been turned into a layer mask for this color fill layer. And we'll talk about how that's affecting the image here in a second. But I just wanted to show you that you can change the type of tone that you get simply by choosing a lighter or more saturated tone of brown, or coming down and choosing a darker tone of brown. So you can really get a really nice kind of custom warm tone effect or brown tone effect here. I'm going to leave it something like that. That looks good. And let me right click in the bottom of my Layers panel and choose Large Thumbnail so we can see that a little bit better. And I'm going to Option or Alt click on the thumbnail of the layer mask here so we can see what it looks like. So this was that luminosity mask that I created by loading a selection of the main RGB channel and then inverting that selection to where we got, a negative version of the image. So when the adjustment layer was created, the solid color fill layer, it added this as the layer mask. So we have a negative version of the image. So what's going on with this negative version of the image in terms of how it is working as a mask? Well, the way that layer masks work, as I mentioned earlier, is that the light areas of the mask show whatever that layer is doing, and the dark areas of the mask do not show it or show it less. So in this image here, the darker parts of the image, which are represented by the lighter parts of this mask, are receiving more of that brown tone effect, whereas the lighter parts of the image, such as the clothing of the women, is represented by these dark areas of the mask, so it's not receiving the brown tone as much. So let's play around with this a little bit. I'm going to Option or Alt click on the thumbnail of that mask to get back to the way it was. I can modify this by now modifying the tones in that mask if I wanted to. So for instance, let me actually show you what this looks like up close and personal, as it were. Again, I'm Option or Alt clicking on the thumbnail of the mask to show the mask here. If I run levels or curves directly on this mask, watch what I can do. I'll use curves here just because I like working with curves. I'll choose Command M or Control M on Windows. Now, an important clarification here, I am not adding a curves adjustment layer for this. I am applying curves directly to this grayscale layer mask. The reason I'm not doing it as an adjustment layer is that will modify the actual values of the image overall. And if it's a color image, which of course this is not, but if it's a color image, that can sometimes wreak havoc with the color tones of the image. But my aim here is to make the darker tones in this layer mask darker. So I can pull down here on these darker tones, and you can see how now I'm modifying the layer mask. So any tones that I make even darker means they're going to receive that brown tone less. And I can make other tones brighter by brightening those up. So I'm going to cancel that because I just wanted to show it to you in that view so you could understand what's going on. Let me Option or Alt click on the thumbnail of the mask to come back to the regular version of the image. And with that mask active, I'm going to choose Command M or Control M on Windows to bring up the curves dialog. And I am going to do the same thing. I'm going to bring this down. And as I do that, you can see that that brown tone is kind of being removed from their clothing. And if I brighten up the other tones, that is kind of getting a little bit richer there in terms of that brown tone. So I actually like that look a little bit better. I think it helps with the contrast a little bit better. Let's even bring that down a bit more. There we go. Now, one final thing to explain about this multiply blend mode here, the multiply blend mode is always darkening things. So if I turn this color fill layer off, you can see that I am getting a lot of darkening happening in the image. And that may or may not be what you want. I think for this image it looks okay, but if the darker shadow tones were getting too dark, you might have to come in and modify them further. So for instance, what I'm going to do there is make the background layer active, and now I'll add another curves adjustment layer. And I'm going to come and get the targeted adjustment tool here, that little finger with the arrows next to it up at the top of the curves properties panel. And now I can drag on these shadow tones and I can lighten those up a bit so they're not being darkened quite as much. And let me actually bring that down there. So that's a way that you could selectively come in and lighten some of those tones if you wanted to. I actually think it looks okay without that, so I'm just going to get rid of that adjustment layer right there. So there you have two different ways that you might choose to modify an image by adding a sepia tone. And of course it could be any type of color tone. It could be a blue tone or a green tone or a red tone or whatever. For this example, we just used a sepia tone. In the first one, we did the kind of dual sepia tone effect where I used two different hue saturation adjustment layers to modify the image. The first thing that I did was I modified its tone and contrast with a curves layer, and then my first hue saturation sepia layer added one level of sepia to the image. I then went in with the layer mask active and I painted with black on the layer mask at varying opacities to remove that sepia tone from some areas. And then finally I added a second hue saturation layer that applied a much more saturated sepia tone and played around with modifying its layer mask as well. Now, let me turn this off and clarify one other thing here about the solid color fill layer set to multiply. If you wanted to modify the sepia tone effect so it wasn't applied equally as I did in the earlier example, one thing you have to realize is that this layer is doing two things. It's adding a sepia tone and it's also darkening the image and enhancing its contrast quite a bit. So you're going to have a bit of a disconnect if you come in and say paint with black to remove the sepia tone. So for instance, if I wanted to remove the sepia tone from the wheel, that's going to be kind of funny because suddenly the wheel is going to get a lot lighter than the area surrounding it. So tonally, there can be a little bit of a disconnect there. So sometimes you just have to realize that is at play. Probably a better way to do that, let me just undo those last few moves there. A better way to do that would be to add another hue saturation layer above that color fill layer and just turn the saturation all the way down and then invert that adjustment layer mask. I'll just click invert in the properties panel. And now I can paint in the unsaturated look. So now I'm kind of doing the opposite of what I did before I painted out the sepia tone. And here I'm painting in a black and white look. And of course, I don't want to get her hair there. I'm not going to do the whole thing there. I just wanted to sort of throw that out as a potential idea there for you. All right, let's move over to another image here and let's talk about color tinting, more like hand coloring, if you will. Although, of course, we are doing this with a stylus, in my case, a Wacom tablet. You might be using a mouse, whatever. But we are mimicking the look of actual, hand coloring. Now, back in the old days, the way that we used to do this, back in the old days, when I was a youngin', we used to hand color with actual oil paints. Go away, Grandpa, go away. Anyway, so back in the old days, if you wanted to hand color a picture, you'd make a black and white print. Sometimes you would sepia tone it, and then you would apply actual oil paints that were designed for photographs. There was a company called Marshall's that made Marshall's photo oils. I think I still have some around here someplace out in the garage. Maybe I'll see if I can dig them up and see what they look like. They're probably all sealed shut from not having been opened for many, many years. But anyway, you can approximate that effect in Photoshop by painting on adjustment layers, similar to how we did the toning effect in the previous example of the women working in the factory. So I have this photograph here that I have already converted to black and white. And actually, let me show you one thing. Let me open that up again into Camera Raw, which is how I processed it. And what I wanted to show you is kind of a little idiosyncrasy about converting to black and white in Camera Raw. Now, this does not happen in Lightroom, but it does happen in Camera Raw. So here's the original color photograph. And what I'm going to do is just come over here to the HSL Grayscale tab, the fourth tab over there. And I'm going to choose to convert to grayscale. And, you know, I'm not going to really make many adjustments. There's not a lot going on in this image in terms of colors. It's mostly just a brown and red and a little gray. That looks okay. Let me actually come back here and open the shadows up a little bit more. That looks good. Now, if I bring this into Photoshop, it is going to be in grayscale mode. And the reason for that is if you look down here at the bottom of the Camera Raw interface, just below the preview, right now, the workflow summary link here says it's set to gray gamma as the color space. So if I click on that, you can see that the color space is indeed set to gray gamma. Now I can open that up and choose another color space here, you know, Adobe RGB, for instance, which would probably be appropriate for this. But I just wanted to point out that if you're doing this through Camera Raw, when you convert to grayscale using the grayscale mix controls there, it will by default be in grayscale mode when you bring it into Photoshop. Now that's not the case if you make a grayscale conversion in Lightroom. In Lightroom it comes in using whatever color space you've specified in the Lightroom preferences. I'm going to cancel this because I already have this image open in Photoshop here. But if I come up and look at the name tab, you can see it does indeed say gray there. So I do want to go to image mode, RGB color. And actually, before I do that, the reason I'm pointing this out twice, I did it with the factory women image, and we're doing it with this image here, is that if you come and try to add a hue saturation adjustment layer, and you see that it is all grayed out, such as we see here, that means that the image is in a color mode that cannot accept a color adjustment layer. And all of these adjustment layers here in the middle, as well as selective color down here at the bottom, are layers that require the image to be in color mode. So that's why I'm pointing this out. All right, let's go back up to the image menu, choose mode, RGB color, and now we're ready to colorize this. So the basic principle is going to be very similar to what we saw with the sepia toning effect that I showed towards the beginning of the episode. And apropos sepia toning, that is something that I often like to do when I hand color an image. And you have to imagine hand color there in air quotes. I'm going to choose Hue Saturation. I'll do the same thing that I did earlier. Click Colorize, enter a value of about 36, and maybe lower the saturation down to maybe 15 or something. The reason I do that is I just find that sometimes it looks a lot more natural adding color if you have this sort of faint warm tone effect on there. And actually, apropos the word faint, I've just lowered my saturation down to 10. So pretty faint there. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a selection of the bricks. So I'm going to get my marquee tool and my rectangular marquee tool, I should specify, and I'm just going to make a selection of those bricks there. And let me actually just come down, start that again. I'll just make a selection of that center part of the bricks. I'm not trying to be super accurate here. That looks good. Now I'm going to hold down the Shift key and add in these areas where parts of the bricks extend out over the edge there. All right, so now I have that selection. I'm going to add a color for the bricks. However, I want to subtract the center stone here that has the puma's head. So once again, with the rectangular marquee tool, I'm going to hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows to put it into subtract mode. I still have my selection active that I initially created. And I'm going to subtract that center square. There we go. Now I'm going to come to the adjustment layer button at the bottom of the layers panel, and I'll add another hue saturation layer. I will click colorize, and it's going to come in as red. I'm going to modify that a little bit. and make it a little bit more of a yellowy red, maybe saturate it a bit more. Something like that looks pretty good for my initial kind of base color of the bricks. All right, so I'm at a hue of 17 and a saturation of 31. Now I could further modify this if I wanted to by slightly feathering the mask. So let me come to the properties panel with the mask active and turn the feather value up. And that's going to make sure that I don't have any really obvious hard edges from the initial hard edge rectangular marquee tool. All right, so I feathered it by about 5 pixels. Now, the other thing I could do if I wanted to really get detailed here is I could get a brush tool and make it small and come in and paint with black over some of these areas between the bricks, kind of like the seams between the bricks where the mortar is, or the grout there. So that way I'm kind of, evening or making it uneven and not quite so uniform. And that's one of the issues with hand coloring that you see a lot of times is this color is applied sort of uniformly over a certain area, and areas like, the mortar between the bricks is the same color as the bricks themselves. And of course, we know that that is not the case with bricks. Or rather, you should know if you've paid close attention to bricks. And I always encourage people to, when they're out and about and they see a brick building or a brick wall, to give some attention, love to the bricks. The bricks will like that. And you will deepen your understanding of how things are colored in real life. All right, so you can see how that is working there. I'm not going to do all of these. This is mainly to give you ideas to apply to your own projects, not for me to finish this project here. All right, and you can see here if we Option or Alt click on the thumbnail, the layer mask, how I've painted there over the bricks to prevent that brick color from showing on some of those seams between the bricks. All right, let's move on. We got off to a good start here. So now let's do a selection of that center stone that has the puma carving on it. And I just need a square selection there. And I'll add a Hue Saturation Layer. And I'm going to click Colorize. And I'm just going to choose more of a yellowy color, kind of maybe a color that suggests sandstone or something like that. I want to make sure I don't get into the green area too much. That looks pretty good. Let's back it off a little bit more towards the red. There we go. And that's all I'm going to do with that. I will slightly feather the layer mask of that a little bit just to soften those edges, make sure I don't have any hard edges. And now let's move on, and I'm going to add a hue and saturation layer to the wall. So I already have a layer mask that I can use for the wall, and that is this initial layer mask that I created for the central brick structure. So I'm going to load that up by holding down the Command key on Mac or the Control key on Windows and clicking on the thumbnail of that previous layer mask. Then I'm going to come up and make the top layer active. I'm going to invert my selection, or rather inverse it, by choosing Select Inverse. So now I have the wall selected, and I also want to subtract out the center part, but I'll do that later. So let me add another Hue Saturation Layer. And click Colorize, and now I want to make the wall a little bit more neutral or bluish tone. And not super blue. I'm going to really desaturate this, but I want to kind of suggest more of a kind of granite look to the stones. That looks good. I'm down to a saturation level about 7. But of course I have the center part of the image. I've lost the color on the puma, so I'll just fix that with the paintbrush tool. I'll get my brush tool. I'm going to paint with black at 100% and just kind of go over that so that neutral bluish color is not affecting the puma. So there we go. Nice thing about this is since I loaded the selection from my previous layer mask, those areas where I had already gone through and painted out the brick tone on the mortar are showing through, and so we have kind of more neutral tones showing through on the mortar there. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Let me do some layer cleanup here and name these so we know what's going on. We got the wall layer, the Puma layer, and the bricks layer. All right, and then this first layer here is just sort of basic sepia or basic warm tone. All right. So now that's one way that you could colorize an image. You would have a different hue and saturation layer with a layer mask for everything in the image that you wanted to have a different color. And obviously, if you had an image where there was a lot of different elements, you would have a lot of different hue and saturation layers. And you might have to make a lot more kind of precise and complicated selections than I have done here. But let me show you another way that you could add color to an image. I'm going to do that by adding an empty layer up at the top of the stack, just an empty layer. And I'm going to call this Moss Stains, because that's what I'm going to colorize. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to my color picker. So I'll click on the foreground swatch, and I'm just going to choose a greenish color. And I can always adjust this later, but something like that looks pretty good, kind of a darker green color. Because what I want to suggest is what you often see in fountains, especially fountains where the water is turned off, as was the case here, where there's often this sort of staining, this kind of green mossy staining where the water comes out and where it's wet all the time. So that's what I want to suggest here. Now, if I just paint with the brush tool on here, it's just going to paint, you know, this green on there, and it looks horrible. But the trick is to use a blending mode. And it's really the same blending mode that's kind of working under the hood on the hue and saturation layers. These hue and saturation layers do not have a specific blend mode tied to them. For instance, if I click on one and look up here at the blend mode menu, it still says normal, but there is a blend mode that is kind of working under the hood, and that is the color blend mode. So if I open up the blend mode menu and choose color, you can see that it is preserving the luminosity of the underlying image, so we can see all the detail, but the color and the saturation is coming from the layer above where I painted on that green color. So that looks pretty good, except let me just erase this and start again fresh so we can paint that in. And let me zoom up close so we can see that a bit better. There we go. All right, so now I'm going to get my brush tool, and I'm going to start painting this in at a low opacity, maybe 30% opacity. I just changed my opacity to 30% by tapping 3 on the keyboard, and since I have a brush tool active, it changes the opacity of the brush. And I'm just going to kind of slowly start to brush in here some of this color so that we get the sense that there is this kind of mossy algae growth there on some of those bricks there where the water is coming out all the time. So just something fairly subtle like that. That's pretty much all I need. And if you make a mistake and you need to remove some color, you can always just switch to the eraser tool. And again, I would suggest bringing this in at lower opacities rather than full strength, because it's just going to allow you to build it up a little bit better. That's good enough for now. Let's explore another way we can add in some color using this method. I'm going to add another new empty layer up at the top, and I'll just call this one irregular color. And the idea here is that, you know, few things in nature, especially old rock walls, are one color. And right now my rock wall is kind of one color. So what I want to do is add in some more irregular color. So I'm going to get my Swatches palette, or panel rather. I'm going to come to the window menu and choose Swatches. And I can just sample some of these colors here. So I'm going to sample a tan color there, and it places it over in the foreground swatch. Now I can paint with that. Let me change the blending mode of that top layer to color. Make sure I have a nice soft edge paint brush here. There we go. And I'm painting about 30% opacity. And every once in a while, what I'm going to do is just come in here and I'm going to vary the size of my brush. And I'm just going to paint in little dabs of this other color here. And let me come and get another color over in the swatches panel. Let me get kind of this more orangey type color. And my aim is not to be super precise here. It's just to kind of add this more random sense to this. And I'm going to go and customize this layer even further. What other colors could I add in here? Maybe another green here or there. Slightly different green there. And maybe even like a purple. That makes no sense, I realized, adding purple, but sometimes it can work. All right, so that looks pretty good. Maybe I'll dial back some of that purple. Get my eraser tool about 30% and kind of bring it back. And then the other thing I can do is I can modify the opacity of this layer. I can bring this layer opacity down a bit so it's not very strong. And that way I can kind of customize this so there's this hint of irregular color in here, that it's not totally the same tone or the same color. Now another thing that I could do is get my brush tool and come in and make the layer mask for the wall layer active. If you recall, what the wall layer does is add in that kind of more neutral, maybe more kind of slate granite looking color to the stone wall. But if I make that layer mask active and I paint with black, say at 40% opacity, I can kind of bring back in a little bit more of the tan color in certain places. And once again, my modus operandi here, if I'm pronouncing the Latin right, is to not cover up all of that slate color, but just parts of it to give that suggestion that the wall is this more irregular color. And you can see here that that is definitely coming through here and looking a lot better in terms of that irregular color. I'm really kind of liking the way that is looking here. Now there are a lot of other things I could do here to customize this. I mentioned earlier that it's a good idea to pay attention to the details. For instance, the mortar between the bricks, I'd want to go through and remove the red color from that. But also, the red color should probably be removed from the branches of this, I guess it's part of an old vine or something that's growing across the bricks. And so I'd want to come in here and very carefully paint with black along those twigs there, because of course they're not going to be the red brick color. And again, I'm painting here on the layer mask for the bricks, painting with black to hide those, to hide that red color there. So you can see there's a lot of detail work that goes into, or could go into, some hand coloring projects. So I'm using the eraser tool to erase the moss color from the twig here, because I don't want the moss color to be on the twig. And in terms of how detailed you get, it really is going to depend on the needs of the individual project, how obsessive compulsive you are with this sort of work, how intricate the details in the image are. There are a lot of variables that are going to go into how detailed and precise you need to be. And you may choose to use more of a loose approach at colorizing your grayscale images, and that is certainly okay too. It really just depends on how you want it to look and the approach that you want to take. Well, I hope that you found that to be interesting, and more to the point, I hope you found it useful. If you're new to that type of work in Photoshop, I hope that this gives you some inspiration and also enough information to get started. So definitely give it a try if you've never done it. It's really fun and rewarding work. When you get into doing a really detailed picture, it almost has kind of a Zen quality to it. You really kind of get lost into it. I always liked hand tinting black and white images. I found it to be very relaxing, and the end result is very satisfying. So give it a try on your own images, or see if you have any cool old black and white family photos from, many, many years ago. That can be really fun. And also kind of very personally rewarding, especially if you, do a really good job on it and have a nice new print made. Could be a nice gift for somebody in your family, And even though it's only mid-August right now, for those of you who celebrate Christmas, December's not that far off in the grand scheme of things, so could be an interesting gift idea. So give it a whirl. And if you don't have any of your own old vintage family photographs to try it out on, head over to Flickr and look up the Library of Congress Flickr stream and check out some of the many, many wonderful images that they have available. Find that persistent URL, download the high-res file from the Library of Congress site, bring it into Photoshop, and you're off and running. So, before I came back here to do this outro, I did go into the garage because I mentioned that I thought I still had my Marshall's photo oils. And indeed, I do. Here they are. This is the hobby set. This is my first set, I think, purchased back in the early 1980s. And this was like $43 at that time, which was pretty pricey back then. And if we look inside here, we see we have this thing here. It's easy and fun to color your photos. And then there's just all these tubes. Mine is a bit messy here. A lot of these are, I'm sure, sealed shut. Now, one thing that would happen with these little tubes here is that if you hadn't used it in a long time, the lids would get stuck on. And so sometimes, in the act of trying to take the top off, you would twist it too far and then cause a rip in the tube. Or I actually had a couple times where I was trying to gently and gingerly use a pair of pliers to take it off and, rip the top of the tube off and, of course, make a big mess. It's a lot easier to do hand coloring in Photoshop than it is with this. But interesting. I might have to see if I can open up any of these up and give it a whirl again. Kind of return to those thrilling days of yesteryear. All right. Well, that about wraps up this episode of TheFIX. Remember, you can go to the website, thisweekinphoto.com/TheFIX, and there's a place for you to subscribe there if you like. And there's also a place where you can contact us and offer up suggestions for future topics to be covered on future shows, or maybe if there are guests that you'd like to see interviewed or profiled or learn how they do their processing, let us know. Just click that Contact Us link up at the top of the page. I'm Seán Duggan. Thanks very much for watching. Catch you next week on TheFIX.